Hi, this is Dr. Nick with the ECG Academy, and we're going to conclude our discussion of atrial fibrillation with this third lesson on atrial fibrillation with aberrant conduction. Well, you should know all about aberrant conduction from my section on interventricular conduction disturbances. So think of atrial fibrillation with aberrant conduction as having a wide QRS complex because of some abnormal interventricular conduction. Now, this is a cardiogram showing a wide complex tachycardia, or WCT. So that means the QRS is wide, and some people just call it a wide QRS complex tachycardia or a wide complex tachycardia. So when you look at the QRS complexes, they are indeed 120 milliseconds or so in duration. It's not terribly wide, but as you scan across, you can see it's rapid, but there is some irregularity to it. So most of the time, the heart rate is running somewhere around 170 or so beats per minute. But sometimes it slows down. Here, this interval is more about 125 beats per minute, and then it speeds up again to more like 180. So it's irregular, and there's no apparent pattern to the irregularity. You can see it gets faster and then a little bit slower, but the QRS always stays the same. It stays that same 120 milliseconds or so. So we would call this atrial fibrillation with a rapid ventricular response, indicating that the AV node is actually very healthy and is conducting these impulses very quickly. And then there happens to be a left bundle branch block, and that's what's making the QRS wide. This happens to be a patient who has a sick left bundle branch, and when they went into atrial fibrillation, all the QRS complexes appeared to be quite wide, and it resulted in this wide complex tachycardia. Well, when you see a wide complex tachycardia and you see this irregular nature to it, it's a pretty good bet that this is atrial fibrillation with some kind of aberrant conduction. It's very unusual to see ventricular tachycardia to be this irregular, although it's not impossible, and we'll talk about that in the final section on ventricular tachyarrhythmias. But let's just say that in this case the patient has two different problems. They have atrial fibrillation, and they also happen to have an underlying left bundle branch block, and the two together gives you this wide complex tachycardia. Well, let's talk a little bit about physiology. So here's the heart and the conduction system, and if you remember, oh no, he's coming up with action potentials again. Well, the Purkinje system action potentials actually are very wide. They're actually wider than the ventricular myocytes, and it takes a long time for the Purkinje fibers to recover from their refractory period. Remember, if you try to stimulate a cell during the plateau phase, and even during phase 3, which is the repolarization phase, you won't get much of a response until the cell comes close to the resting membrane potential. Then at this point somewhere, you'll be able to get a response from the cell by stimulating the cell, and you'll get another action potential out of it. But there's a certain period, known as a refractory period, that the cell is not excitable. It's busy with this action potential, and this sequence of ionic currents has to reset itself before the cell gets ready to fire again. Well, now keep in mind that when the patient is having atrial fibrillation, the AV node is being bombarded with rapid signals, and it doesn't know which ones to pass. And so every now and then it's going to let a signal down to the bundle branches, and depending upon whether those bundle branches have recovered from refractoriness, that'll determine whether in fact that signal results in a QRS complex. But remember in my discussion of IVCDs that what sometimes happens is the left bundle branch may have a slightly shorter refractory period than the right bundle branch. If this is the left bundle and this is the right bundle, then what can sometimes happen is the AV node may let a beat down right at this moment, and it reaches the left bundle, which is able to conduct the signal, but the right bundle is going to be refractory and will fail to conduct the signal. And this will result in a functional right bundle branch block. Well, this happens quite often during atrial fibrillation because the AV node is passing signals down in a rapid, somewhat random, chaotic fassion. The coupling interval, or the time in between beats, will vary from one beat to another. So let me show you what can happen. Here's an example of atrial fibrillation. When you glance across at the forest, you can see it's quite irregular. There are longer intervals at around 110 to 120 beats per minute. There are shorter intervals that are much faster, and there's no pattern to it. And looking in between beats, you can see the slight undulation in the baseline, which is consistent with atrial fibrillation. There's no discrete P waves, although sometimes you get big fibrillatory waves that look like Ps, but not really. But now look at V1 and pay attention to the first 3 beats in V1. Well, this one's not right on the borderline. But these 2 beats in V1 look like they conduct fairly normally. And there are pretty long intervals in between those beats here, about 120 beats per minute, and this one about 110 beats per minute. But then right here you have 2 beats that come down much faster. If you measure back from this line, you can see it's about 160 beats per minute. But this is a very short coupling interval. And what happens is these 2 beats conduct aberrantly. There's an interventricular conduction delay that occurs. And if you know anything about 12-lead ECGs, you have an RSR prime in V1 that's consistent with a right bundle branch block. But the rest of the beats don't have a right bundle branch block. What happened is the AV node let this beat down so close after this prior beat that the right bundle branch had not recovered from refractoriness and was not capable of conducting the impulse. And so the impulse went down the left bundle and then came around the back door to the right side of the heart, giving rise to a widening of the QRS complex. So this is a great example of 2 beats that conduct very rapidly and they encounter a functional right bundle branch block, and we refer to this as atrial fibrillation with aberrant conduction. It's easy to recognize this when you just see 1 or 2 beats, and this first beat is very closely coupled. But it actually happens much more frequently than you think. And there was a fellow many years ago who described a particular phenomenon. And let me go back to this action potential. We talked about the action potential duration and how there's a certain refractory period. But it turns out that that refractory period can change from one beat to the next. And it depends on the previous R to R interval. In other words, when the heart rate is very fast, the refractory period tends to be shorter. In fact, the action potential for these beats winds up being shorter than the situation where the heart rate is very slow, where in fact your action potential winds up being a lot longer, as I've drawn here. If you remember when we first talked about measuring QT intervals, the QT interval changes depending upon the heart rate. And at faster heart rates, the QT interval generally shortens. This is a reflection of the fact that at faster heart rates, the action potential gets shorter and the refractory period gets shorter. So with shortening of the action potential and shortening of this refractory period, the QT gets shorter. But what happens is this action potential duration changes from one beat to the next. And you see that especially with atrial fibrillation, so that if you have a couple of long intervals and then a short interval, this long R to R interval right here results in this beat having a relatively long action potential. So if another beat comes down quickly, it may encounter refractoriness in one of the bundles. This was described by a guy named Ashman, and it's known as Ashman's phenomenon. Now let me show you an example of that. Here's the rhythm strip that I got from the telemetry unit, and it's pretty easy to recognize this as atrial fibrillation. You have this jiggly bass line here. You've got a ventricular rhythm that's irregularly irregular. It's kind of fast here, and then it breaks up and it becomes very irregular here. And then down in the second strip, you've got a run of a rapid rhythm because the AV node sent a whole bunch of signals down. And then there's a bit of a pause because the AV node sort of took a little break here. And following this pause, you have a run of a wide complex tachycardia. Now, of course, you should never trust what you read on a rhythm strip unless you wrote it yourself. So this says possible 6 beats of V-tach. Of course, the word possible is how they hedge their bet versus bundle branch conducted AFib. Well, it turns out that this is a typical example of Ashman's phenomenon. Ashman's is commonly referred to as long-short. And by long-short, we mean that this long R to R interval, followed by a short R to R interval, results in aberrant conduction of this beat here. So this beat conducts aberrantly because the long R to R interval resulted in a long action potential of this beat. So when you have a long action potential, the next beat that comes down, if the AV node lets one down rapidly, results in aberrant conduction because one of the bundled branches hasn't recovered yet. Now you'd ask, well, why is it that you got a run of wide complex beats? Because if you look at beat number 2 over here, well, it doesn't have that long short pattern, so why did it conduct with a bundle branch block? Well, that's where this basic course introduces you to some advanced topics. Let's go back to the conduction system here. Let's say that you have an Ashman beat that blocks in the right bundle branch. Okay, it's not able to get down the right bundle branch. So what happens is the signal is able to get down the left bundle system. It gets to the left ventricle, but as it crosses at the apex and across the septum, it's able to enter the right bundle branch system. And since the right bundle branch system is excitable at that point because the signal never got there, well, it's able to travel retrogradely a certain distance until it encounters refractory tissue from that beat. Well, now, when the next beat comes down, this green one is number 2, well, the right bundle branch is refractory because it had retrograde, in other words, backward conduction, known as concealed conduction, in a retrograde fashion up the right bundle. And so when this impulse comes down, it finds the right bundle branch is still refractory. And so it has to do the same thing, go down the left side, and then it manages to get across again, and then back up the right bundle. So when the next beat comes down, it still finds the right bundle refractory. And so you can see that the result is a salvo of wide complex beats because of this phenomenon, with the signal going across the septum and retrogradely penetrating the right bundle and keeping the right bundle refractory. So isn't that kind of cool? Well, at some point, the right bundle has enough time here to recover, and so this beat winds up going down both bundles, and you get a narrow complex which finishes out this run of this rapid burst of atrial fibrillation. But this wide complex tachycardia right here is a beautiful example of Ashman's phenomenon, and you can be comfortable calling this atrial fibrillation with aberrancy rather than having to call it ventricular tachycardia. Well, we'll talk about ventricular tachycardia in the next section, and that'll finish this course in basic arrhythmia analysis in the ECG Academy. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this kind of high-tech discussion on atrial fib with aberrant conduction. Now, aren't you glad you subscribed to the ECG Academy? Well, this is Dr. Nick. Thanks for subscribing.